In one of his books, Shane Claiborne makes an important distinction for us to consider today. Claiborne reveals that Jesus doesn't call people to believe, or I should say to just believe. Believers are a dime a dozen these days, he says. People believe in all sorts of things, but it doesn't transform them all the time. It doesn't change the trajectory of their lives. In fact, in this day and age, it seems like you can believe something one moment, and then the next moment believe something entirely contrary, and you can do that without apology. They just kind of stand there, these paradoxes at times. Now, there are plenty of believers out there, he says. What Jesus is calling people to is discipleship. He is asking them to believe in a way that they drop everything and come and follow Him. This is significantly different than just being a believer. Would it make a difference if I told you that in that Romans passage, when it says, call upon the name of the Lord with your mouth, and we repeat that a lot, but what if you knew that doing so would get you killed? Because that's who he's speaking to, that audience. That kind of speaking with your mouth, with your whole life of your faith in Christ. Over in another gospel, in chapter 9 of Luke's gospel, Jesus spends all 62 verses of that chapter helping these potential believers become disciples and followers. He commissions them at the beginning of that chapter. Then he shows them how to trust in sharing and in God's miracles as he performs the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. After that, he reveals to 3 of them his glory at the transfiguration. Finally, he concludes with some words about why people choose to believe but rarely choose to follow. In those passages, he describes a man who asked Jesus to follow, that he would be able to follow Jesus. And Jesus pointed out to that man, you will be a wanderer without a home. And there is no more mention of that man in the gospel. Another person is invited by Jesus to follow, but he desires to bury a parent. There is, we should also note, no description of whether the parent has actually died, so this may be a long-term scenario here, caretaking. Jesus says that this is not the way of following. And then finally, Jesus calls a person who just wants to go and tell his family goodbye. Jesus says such a response is actually turning down the call to follow, because the invitation of God calls us out of the life that we have grown comfortable in. And it is very easy, it's a very fine line between just saying goodbye to those things and trying to get Jesus to stay with us in that life. Get Jesus to walk with us more than we choose to walk with Jesus, you might say. Throughout this entire chapter 9 of Luke, throughout these glimpses into the gift and the challenge of accepting God's invitation to follow and not just believe, Jesus teaches in a way that intentionally harkens back to the prophet Elijah. Elijah, by the way, was the one whom many were looking for in Jesus' time as a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. And particularly here at the very end of chapter 9, in this series of what we might say, things that prevent following, Jesus is using direct references to the passage about Elijah and Elisha that we heard read today from 1 Kings chapter 19. That 1 Kings story of following has even an added depth to it than what we get in Luke's gospel. It has what you might say, a humanness to it. And it's worth examining as we consider today what it means to be a follower and not just a believer. Let's take a look at that Old Testament lesson for today. Chapter 19 in 1 Kings picks up right at the beginning with Elijah feeling like he is the only one who is following God in his day. He begins a pity party, if we were honest. And he shows a desire to stop following. He runs in fear from those who he has upset in his warnings against worshiping two masters. He said, you cannot worship, and Jesus would repeat this, obviously, God and idols or false gods. And they tried to kill him for it. Elijah thinks that he's alone, but God points out that Elijah is not alone. He is one of 7,000 followers in the vicinity. But Elijah reveals some of our human characteristics when it comes to following. He is still frustrated. He is still down. He is confused about the unknown. He has fears. He shows late in life frustrations about his sense of purpose and whether it is worth it to keep following God, or in the language he uses, to retire from being a disciple. He has anxiety and depression about being a witness in the broken world that he lives in. We get this. We get how easy it is to stop following God and to let our changing life station, our circumstances, our fears and anxieties, our desire to control the unknown as we get older, to allow us to pull us in a little bit. Elijah is not Jesus. Elijah is human. He leaves the path, 1 Kings 19 says. And God begins to follow Elijah around a little bit. And he repeats this critical existential question. What are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? Indeed. Elijah repeats to God this one phrase that he's prepared as his retirement speech from being this follower, and he repeats it again and again, and each time he repeats it, it doesn't satisfy God, and God moves him a little bit to a different place, and continues to ask the question, what are you doing here? Elijah ends up in a cave, as we heard in our passage, hiding from the invitation to follow, convinced that his role now is just to be a believer. And God meets him there. Not in earthquake or fire or storm, but in silence. And God invites Elijah to come out and to approach him. And Elijah does, and Elijah approaches God, hiding himself, covering himself, as we know is the only way to approach God, but he does so in his mantle, which is his cloak, and that kind of makes sense. But the mantle is also the symbol of his followership. This is significant. He approaches God and wraps himself in the symbol of him accepting again the invitation to follow. Again, we hear the profound question come from God. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are we doing? What is the answer to this question? God does not address all of Elijah's understandable feelings of reservation and drawing back in and retiring a bit from the nature of following. He doesn't address it, but he does call him to continue following. Come out of this cave. Come out of hiding. Come out of your fears and your frustrations about following at this stage of your life. Come out. What else are you doing here, Elijah? Besides this event of Elijah hiding from following late in life in a cave, we get another important event about following. For as Elijah leaves the cave, he is sent to Elisha. Elisha is young. He is working a field with 12 yokes of oxen. Translation, Elisha was a rich man. Elijah places his mantle on Elisha as a symbol of God inviting him to follow. Elisha seems open to this invitation, but desires to say goodbye to his family, and he turns to the plow again. We've heard this before, right? This is the warning of Jesus in real time. Elijah responds with a unique version of the same question that God hit him with. You don't have to answer to me. Only God. But God is going to want to know. Elijah knows this from personal experience. What are you then doing with your life? Are you going to turn away from God's invitation because of life's accumulations, he seems to be saying, or because of your preference that God would work with your constraints, Elisha? And like the event with Elijah, Elisha does not offer a profound word of his awakening. He simply, as he is walking back, makes the changes needed. Elijah left the cave. Elisha goes straight back to the yoked animals and dismantles the things that were keeping him from following. He took apart the yoke. He killed the cows. Do you get the image here? He killed the cows next to the prophet who said you can't follow idols and God. He kills the cows and sacrificed those things that were keeping him from following to the Lord. He irrevocably gets rid of the things that would keep him from following. Indeed, he uses them in the passage, it says, to feed some people who we didn't even know were there to begin with. For is that not how it is when we choose to follow God? That God will show us who to serve when we are ready to follow. A moment that seemed just about Elisha and Elijah quickly revealed a previously invisible hungry population. This is what following does. Elijah and Elisha have chosen to answer the call to follow with their lives. One of them in the later stages and one in his youth. Friends, no matter where we are in our station of life, we are being asked the question, what are we doing here? It's the question that at times troubles us. It's the question that gets at the heart of our purpose in life, especially when our life hits a critical stretch. But when it is God asking us this, what are we doing here? It is not just a philosophical question. It is in connection to the invitation to follow, and it is the most important question that we have to answer. And so I ask us, what are we doing here? And what are the things that are keeping us stuck and hidden and from following? Are you stuck in the confusion of unknowns? A fear of late life anxieties and depressions? Are you trapped by the contraptions of the life you have accumulated to date? What are the fears keeping you in that cave? What are the cows and the contraptions that we need to dismantle so that we may pick up the mantle that is our invitation to follow? We too may come to the cave to hide out until the end. But God calls us to the edge of that mountain, even in the later stages of life. And we may want to keep the lives we have built in comfort, but God is asking us to unburden ourselves from those yokes and to take up the mantle of followership. What will God call us to do then? I don't know. But I do know that God speaks into the stillness of our living and asks us clearly, what are you doing here with the life that you still have? And I know that we answer it not with our belief system or our attendance, but with our following. Whose mantle is it that we wear? Whose life is it that we bear? On this Moravian Church Anniversary Sunday, when we gather around the table to remember renewal in our fellowship, we should ask ourselves boldly what we are doing here. We should listen to the Spirit moving in our lives and in our church at this time and allow it to pull out that question, what are we doing here? And we should look at all of our answers. And we should ask if they reflect followership or not. What are you doing here? And what's keeping you from following? Our lives, as individuals and as a community, will answer that question. Amen. Friends, we are